You always needed attention. He didn't raise his voice when he said it. That was the part that stayed with me. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was said the way people state facts. Calm, certain, almost bored. I was standing in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding a dish towel I'd already folded twice. The room didn't stop. The clock kept ticking. Someone shifted in their chair. A glass clinked softly against the table. No one laughed. No one corrected him. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I'd imagined it. The words felt too sharp for how casually they were delivered. I replayed them in my head, slower this time, as if changing the speed might soften them. You always needed attention. I felt heat rise to my face, but it didn't turn into tears. It just sat there, heavy, like something I didn't know where to put. My throat tightened, not enough to choke me, just enough to remind me I was being watched. I looked down at the towel. The edges weren't straight anymore. I focused on that, straightening it, folding it again, anything but looking up. Inside my head, 100 responses lined up all at once. I could list everything I'd done. I could explain. I could laugh it off. I could ask him what he meant. I could say that's not true. But none of the words felt safe. Not here. Not with the way the room had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that waits to see how much damage you'll allow. So I stayed still. I noticed small things instead. The hum of the refrigerator. The way my fingers were shaking just enough to be annoying. The fact that he had already turned away like the sentence was finished business. That hurt more than the sentence itself, because it meant he didn't need my reaction. He expected my silence. And everyone else seemed to expect it too. I swallowed. I took a slow breath through my nose. I kept my eyes down. I let the moment pass the way it clearly wanted to, without resistance, without noise, without me. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask for clarity. I didn't even look hurt. I took the insult the same way I'd taken so many other things, quietly, neatly, without making it anyone else's problem. At the time, it felt like the safest choice, the easiest one. I didn't say anything, and that's where everything changed. I didn't always notice how much space I took up by staying quiet. Back then, my days were already full before they started. I woke up before the alarm most mornings, not because I wanted to, but because my body had learned the schedule better than my mind. The house was always quiet at that hour. No questions yet, no needs spoken out loud, just a short window where everything was still mine. I used that time carefully. I packed lunches with whatever was left from the night before. I checked homework folders, even when I already knew they were empty. I counted things without writing them down. Bills, groceries, hours until the next paycheck. I learned to do math in my head because paper made it feel too real. I didn't complain about it. I didn't even think of it as strength. It was just what had to be done. By the time everyone else woke up, I'd already lived a full morning. Hair pulled back, coffee reheated, never fresh, shoes by the door, lined up so no one would trip. Small details like that mattered to me. They still do. I was the person people relied on without thinking about it. If something needed to be remembered, I remembered it. If something needed to be handled quietly, I handled it. If someone needed help, I found a way. And if no one noticed, I didn't bring it up. That part came naturally, staying out of the way, making things easier, not asking for much. I told myself that needing less meant I was doing better. There were moments, small, almost invisible ones, where I thought someone might see it. When I stayed up late fixing something I didn't break, when I rearranged my schedule so everyone else could keep theirs, when I showed up tired but on time again and again. But appreciation never really arrived, not directly. Instead, there were assumptions that I'd manage, that I didn't mind, that I was fine. I learned early that being dependable made you useful, not valued. So I leaned into it. I kept things running. I smoothed over tension. I absorbed comments that were sharp but disguised as jokes. When something went wrong, eyes drifted toward me. When things went right, no one asked how. I didn't resent it, at least not consciously. Resentment takes energy, and I didn't have much to spare. I told myself this was temporary, that one day things would even out, that effort would be recognized eventually. But over time, something subtle happened. My silence became part of the environment, expected, comfortable, almost necessary. I was the one who didn't need attention, the one who didn't make scenes, the one who could take things. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, that turned into permission. Permission to overlook me, permission to speak about me instead of to me, permission to decide things on my behalf. By the time that sentence was spoken, "You always needed attention," it didn't come out of nowhere. It landed on years of quiet effort, years of being useful instead of seen, years of choosing peace over explanation. I just hadn't realized yet how expensive that choice had been. And I still didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was starting to understand what my silence had already cost me. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it harder to name. At first, it was small things, conversations that stopped when I walked into the room, plans that were already decided by the time I heard about them, messages answered hours later, if at all. Nothing dramatic enough to point at, nothing anyone would admit to. I told myself I was imagining it. Then I started hearing things indirectly. Someone mentioned a decision that involved me, said casually, like it had already been settled. When I asked how it came up, there was a pause. A look exchanged between two people, then a shrug. "We just assumed you'd be okay with it." Assumed, not asked. I nodded, even though my chest tightened. I didn't want to make it awkward. I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I told myself it wasn't personal, that people were busy, that I was reading too much into it. But the pattern kept repeating. I found out about a family conversation days after it happened. Everyone knew what had been said except me. When I asked why I wasn't included, the answer came quickly, rehearsed. "We didn't think you'd want to be part of that." I wanted to ask what that meant. I didn't. Instead, I listened as they explained what I thought, how I felt, what I was capable of handling. They spoke with confidence, like they'd taken careful notes on my life. One of them laughed lightly and said, "You know how she gets." No one asked me how I actually got. There were moments when I almost interrupted, when I felt the words press against my ribs, demanding space, clarifications, corrections, simple truths. But every time I opened my mouth, the conversation moved on without me. It was like watching a version of myself being built in real time, one I didn't recognize and wasn't allowed to edit. What hurt the most wasn't that they disagreed with me. It was that they didn't feel the need to check. I started noticing how often my name came up when I wasn't there, how comfortable they were deciding what I could handle, what I deserved, what I meant. I wasn't part of the discussion. I was the subject. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Part of me was frozen. Another part was trying to protect what little peace I had left. I told myself confrontation would only make things worse, that if I stayed calm, things would settle. Instead, the distance grew. Support turned conditional. Help came with explanations. Questions sounded more like accusations. When I spoke carefully, I was told I was overthinking. When I stayed quiet, My silence was used as agreement. I remember sitting alone one night, phone in my hand, rereading a message that felt wrong but looked polite. I stared at it long enough that the screen dimmed. That was the moment it finally landed. They weren't confused about me. They had already decided who I was, and it wasn't someone worth listening to. I put the phone down, I sat there in the quiet, and for the first time, I felt something colder than sadness. I felt replaced. And I didn't know yet how far they were willing to go, or how much they were counting on me to stay silent while they did. Once the story about me settled into place, it spread quickly. I didn't hear it directly at first. It came through softened versions, passed along with concern layered on top. Someone would pull me aside and lower their voice like they were doing me a favor. "They're just worried about you." Worried. That word became a shield for everything that followed. If I questioned a decision, I was told I was being defensive. If I explained myself, I was told I was overreacting. If I went quiet, they said it proved their point. "You've always been sensitive," someone said, gently, like it was a diagnosis. Another added, "You take things too personally." I started to feel like every emotion I had was being examined under a light I didn't control. The strangest part was how confident they sounded. They spoke about my feelings with more certainty than I felt myself. When I tried to correct something, just a detail, nothing dramatic, the response came back immediately. "That's not how it happened," or "I think you're remembering it wrong." You're letting your stress talk. Stress, sensitivity, misunderstanding. They stacked those words carefully, one on top of the other, until my perspective felt small and unreliable. I found myself pausing before I spoke, rehearsing sentences in my head, trying to remove any trace of emotion before it reached my mouth. Even then, it wasn't enough. My calm was interpreted as coldness, my silence as manipulation, my boundaries as punishment. At one point, someone actually said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I remembered nodding, even though I didn't know what this was anymore. Behind closed doors, decisions kept happening. I was informed afterward, usually with a justification attached. They framed it as kindness, as relief, as something they'd taken off my plate. "You have enough going on," they said. "We didn't want to burden you." But I felt the burden anyway, just without the respect of being included. The pressure wasn't loud. It was constant, a low hum that followed me everywhere. The expectation that I would bend, agree, smooth things over like I always had, that I would apologize for tension I didn't create. I could feel them waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to prove that they were right about me all along. And part of me started to wonder if staying silent was helping or hurting. The doubt crept in late at night when there was no one around to observe my reactions. I replayed conversations, searched for mistakes, questioned my own memory. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I believed them, but because I could feel something shifting, a tightening inside me, a sense that every word I said was being collected, measured, and used. So I said less. I listened more. And I started to realize that my silence wasn't calming the situation at all. It was giving them room. Room to push further, room to decide more, room to see just how much I would take before I broke. They thought I was shrinking. They didn't see what was forming underneath the quiet, or how close I was to choosing something very different. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. What used to be suggestions turned into expectations. What used to be discussions became announcements. I noticed it in the way things were worded. Less, "What do you think?" and more, "This is what we're doing." And somehow it always involved something of mine, my time, my resources, my flexibility. There were conversations about money that didn't include me until the end, decisions framed as practical, necessary, unavoidable. I was told it made sense, that everyone agreed that this was the easiest solution. For now, they added, as if temporary things don't leave marks. I asked careful questions, neutral ones, the kind that couldn't be accused of emotion. Each question was met with a sigh, a look, a reminder of how complicated things already were. "Why are you making this so hard?" someone said, not unkindly. I stopped asking. The pressure tightened around areas I couldn't ignore. Schedules changed without notice. Plans involving my children were discussed like logistics, not lives. I was informed of arrangements that affected us all, delivered in a tone that suggested I should be grateful someone else had handled it. I remember standing in the doorway of a room I no longer felt welcome in, listening to people talk about what would be best for everyone. My name came up, followed by a pause. "Well," someone said, "she'll adjust." That sentence followed me for days. The expectation was clear now. I was supposed to absorb the inconvenience, the loss, the discomfort, quietly, the way I always had. They waited for resistance, but only enough to confirm their story about me. If I complied, it was proof I didn't care enough. If I hesitated, it was proof I was difficult. There was no version of me that didn't serve their narrative. I could feel it in my body before I admitted it to myself. The tightness in my chest, the way my shoulders stayed tense even when I sat down, the exhaustion that didn't lift after sleep. Still, I didn't break. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't accuse or defend. That seemed to unsettle them more than an outburst would have. They leaned in closer, pressed harder, pushed boundaries they hadn't touched before. I saw it in the way questions were asked, sharper now, less patient. "Are you going to be okay with this? Can we count on you? You're not going to make this a problem, right?" They were watching my face when they said it, waiting for something to crack. But something else happened instead. The silence between us changed. It wasn't passive anymore. It wasn't confused or apologetic. It had weight to it, intention. I realized, standing there and listening to them talk over me, that they thought they had me cornered. They believed there was nowhere else for me to go. They didn't know that I had already stopped trying to fit into the space they were shrinking, and they didn't know how dangerous that misunderstanding was. The moment didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no final straw anyone else could point to later and say, "That's when it happened." It was just me, alone, sitting at the edge of my bed after everyone else had gone to sleep. The house was quiet in the honest way. No tension, no listening for footsteps, no bracing myself for the next conversation. I could hear the faint sound of traffic outside, the steady rhythm of something continuing whether I was ready or not. I stared at my hands for a long time. They looked older than I remembered, tired, useful. They had carried a lot without being asked if they wanted to. That's when the thought came, not dramatic, not emotional, clear. They're not going to stop. Not because they hated me, not because they were cruel, but because nothing was forcing them to. My silence hadn't confused them. It hadn't softened them. It had trained them. I felt it settle in my chest, not panic, not anger, certainty. The kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't need validation. I realized something else then, something quieter and harder to admit. I had been waiting for someone to notice, waiting for fairness to show up on its own, waiting for them to realize they'd gone too far. And in all that waiting, I had paused my own life. I stood up slowly, not with resolution, not with urgency, just movement. I reached for a folder I hadn't opened in a long time, slid it out from where it had been tucked away. Papers, notes, things I'd kept without knowing why. I didn't organize them. I didn't make a plan. I just looked. And in that moment, I made a decision that didn't require anyone else's agreement. I would stop explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I would stop offering access to those who used it against me. I would stop confusing endurance with peace. It wasn't a vow, it wasn't brave, it was practical. The next day, I made one small change, something no one noticed, something that didn't announce itself. A phone call, a question asked quietly, information requested without emotion attached. Nothing changed right away. No reactions, no apologies, no sudden clarity. But I felt it, a shift in how I held myself, in what I was willing to carry, in what I was no longer willing to hand over just to keep things smooth. They still thought I was standing in the same place. They didn't know I had already stepped out of reach, and they definitely didn't know how close the truth was to catching up with all of us. The truth didn't arrive with drama. It came the way real things do, quietly, officially, and too solid to argue with. I was sitting at a table, hands folded, listening while someone else read from a document that had my name on it, not as a suggestion, not as an opinion, as a fact. Dates, numbers, records, things that didn't care how anyone felt about me. I didn't look up right away. I already knew what it said. I had known for a while. That was the point. What I noticed instead was the silence on the other side of the table, the kind that doesn't rush to fill itself, the kind that happens when there's nowhere left to redirect blame. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. No one spoke. When the reading ended, there was a pause that stretched longer than it should have. I could feel eyes on me now, not curious, not dismissive, careful. As if they were seeing me for the first time and trying to adjust quickly. "That's not what we thought," someone finally said. I looked up then, slowly, calmly. "I know," I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised them. It surprised me too. They started talking after that, explaining, reframing, searching for a way to soften what had just landed. Words like miscommunication and assumptions floated around the room, looking for somewhere safe to land. None of them landed on me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct every detail. I didn't point out how long I'd been trying to say the same things without proof attached. I just listened. At one point, someone laughed, not out of humor but nerves. Another person reached for their phone, then stopped, like they weren't sure what role they were supposed to play anymore. The balance had shifted. You could feel it. Questions started coming, but they were different now. Slower, more careful. What do you want to do? How do you want to handle this? They were asking me. I took a breath before answering, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to choose my words with intention. "I'm going to do what I should have been allowed to do from the beginning," I said. "Decide for myself." No accusation, no edge, just reality. No one argued with that. Later, when we stood up to leave, someone touched my arm lightly and said, "I'm sorry, we didn't realize." I nodded. That was all. Because the apology wasn't the point. The point was that no one was speaking for me anymore. No one was defining me in my absence. No one was comfortable assuming I would simply adjust. As I walked away, I felt something unfamiliar but steady settle into place. Not victory, authority. And I knew, without needing anyone to admit it out loud, that the version of me they had relied on was gone for good. Things didn't go back to how they were after that. They changed shape instead. Conversations became shorter, more careful. The casual certainty people once had about me disappeared, replaced with pauses, the kind where someone checks themselves before speaking. I noticed it right away, not because I was looking for it, but because it used to be so effortless for them. Now it wasn't. No one announced the shift. There were no meetings, no acknowledgments of what had been taken or assumed. Life just adjusted around the truth the way it always does, quietly, unevenly, without ceremony. Some relationships cooled. Others stayed polite but distant. A few tried to return to normal, as if nothing fundamental had changed. But something had. Inside me, mostly. I didn't feel the urge to explain anymore, or to fill silences that weren't mine to fix. When questions came, I answered them plainly. When they didn't, I let that be information too. I wasn't angry. That surprised people. They expected bitterness, or satisfaction, or some visible reaction that would confirm I'd been holding something back all along. But what I felt instead was a kind of tired clarity. I saw things the way they were now. Who could listen? Who needed control? Who mistook my endurance for permission? I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. I didn't make declarations. I just adjusted where I placed my energy, my time, my trust. Some people noticed. Some didn't. That was okay. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once, and it didn't arrive evenly. There were things I let go of because carrying them felt pointless, and there were things I kept, not as weapons, but as boundaries. I stopped offering access to people who only valued me when I stayed quiet. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever been labeled, minimized, or spoken over simply because you didn't fight back, you're not alone. If you've learned to survive by staying quiet, by being easy, by not asking for too much, someone will recognize that in you. And if you want to share your thoughts or your own experience, I'm reading. Stay here if stories like this matter to you.